just more headlines today that show more and more clearly that on the question of Labor's proposed Indigenous voice to the Parliament, Australians will be asked to sign a blank cheque, to say yes to something that's not been explained, to take a leap in the dark. The latest news is that the government's Indigenous working group that's hoping to reassure opposition leader Peta Credlin into supporting the voice expect to take at least 6 months after the vote, if it gets up, to work out exactly what it is they want. Some questions, reports The Australian today, will not be settled until the government and Indigenous communities complete a process of dialogue mid-2024. Then, after that, there'll be a further series of parliamentary committees, more consultation and more possible changes. That means the voice may not be operational until at least 2025. So whatever else might happen when Peta Credlin meets with Aboriginal leaders tomorrow, he won't get a definitive answer to the 15 questions he recently posed, including how members of any voice would be chosen and whether there would be an agreed definition of Aboriginality. Relevant, of course, because only Aboriginal people will have a seat on the voice and only Aboriginal people will be able to vote for it. In an important article for the West Australian Law Society, Curtin University Professor Bertrand de Villiers has posed his own questions based on the failures of past Indigenous bodies that he says must be answered before Australians can reasonably be asked to vote yes or no. His 7 questions include: what are the objectives of the voice? Who will decide when its advice is needed? Will its advice be binding? And will any failure to take its advice be judicially reviewable? Every previous Indigenous advisory body has ultimately failed, he says, because of the gulf between the ambitions of the body itself to promote self-determination for Aboriginal people and the interests of government in just getting more local input into the design of Indigenous programs. If past experiences are anything to go by, he says, the voice will seek greater involvement in broader socio-economic government policies, while the government of the day will seek to reduce the scope of consultations to the minimum. Therein lies the challenge. That's why the most important of his questions is this: why must the voice be constitutionally sanctioned, if at all? Because if it fails, as all others have, he says one can only imagine how complex it would be to rectify the situation. What he means there is undo the mess of any voice. Professor de Villiers points out that the most well-known Indigenous body in the world is the Sami Parliament of Finland, and that the Finnish constitution merely provides that, and I quote, in their native region, the Sami have linguistic and cultural self-government as provided by an act. Now, the professor's conclusion is that it might be best for the voice to be set up first and then operational before any move to amend the constitution, so that all these sorts of details can be ironed out. That's, of course, if you accept the principle that we divide people by race in this country, which I don't and won't concede. The biggest problem here is that different people want different things from the voice. Some want it to be merely symbolic constitutional recognition, but others want it to give Aboriginal people a virtual veto over the decisions that governments make for all of us. Others see it as the first step towards a treaty and ultimately self-government, perhaps even a separate country for Indigenous Australians. De Villiers says that these hard questions must be answered before any referendum, not afterwards. If the voice is only going to give non-binding advice, says Professor de Villiers, say it plainly and clearly. Don't use slippery words to create a different impression. With only 13% of us claiming to pollsters that we can even explain what the voice is, there are certainly lots of questions that need to be answered. But here's the point: they're not going to be, because the voice's proponents know that if the voice is to be what they really want it to be, well, then the Australian people, if they know that, they'll never support it. Don't be honest and upfront with us, because they fear that people, quite rightly, will just vote no.